Okay, so we are now moving on to chapter 9, which is going to talk all about photosynthesis. And so we'll get into that process a little bit more later, but we've got a couple kind of background things we need to do first. So today we're going to talk about ATP and what cells use ATP for, and then we'll get into chloroplasts that we learned about last chapter and a little bit more about their structure. So when we think about energy, okay, energy is just the ability to do work. And when I say work, I'm talking about work in the scientific sense, which means you're moving something or you're able to create a change, not work as we use every day, like I can come to my job here and work, okay? Living things, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday or today in class, that all living things need energy to maintain that homeostasis. So to keep our bodies warm enough, we need to use energy, right? To digest food, to give us the right blood sugar, to do everything, we need energy. We need energy to grow, we need energy to develop and have all these specialized cells in our bodies. We need energy to move things throughout our body. We need energy to build new molecules like amino acids, which turn into proteins. We need energy to respond to our environment. Obviously, us as humans, as animals that can move around, we need energy to move us from one place to another. Hey, we need energy for everything. And there's a lot of different forms of energy out there. Light that you see around us is energy. Heat is energy. Electricity is energy. Okay, we're going to focus in this chapter on light energy because you need light for photosynthesis, and then turning that into chemical energy. And so chemical energy is going to be energy that's stored in the chemical bonds of compounds. So depending on how atoms are arranged in that compound, that's going to have some energy stored up. So if you break that bond, you can then release that energy. And so the most important compound that you have in your body and that we're going to talk about this chapter is called adenosine triphosphate, ATP. Okay? That tri part, tri means three phosphates. That's going to be important when we get to the next slide here. So ATP, we're going to focus on this a little bit. ATP is important, and we're just going to stick with ATP for short because I don't want to say adenosine triphosphate all the time. So ATP, simply put, is the energy source for all of your cells. Okay? So what makes up an ATP molecule, we have, which this over here is an ATP molecule. We have adenine, which would be this blue part up here. We have a 5-carbon sugar called a ribose, which would be this green little pentagon. There's 5 of them, okay? And then there's 3 phosphate groups, right? Triphosphate. So 1, 2, 3. Each phosphate group has a phosphorus in it. These 3 phosphate groups are the key. They're the most important part for ATP to be able to store energy and then release energy for your cells to use. So similar to that, we have a compound called adenosine diphosphate, ADP. And adenosine diphosphate is really similar to ATP, but di, right? Di means 2. So ADP only has 2 phosphate groups instead of 3. So this right here is adenosine diphosphate, ADP. And you notice we still have this adenine. We still have ribose here. But instead of 3 phosphate groups, this picture on the left only has 2 phosphate groups. And so you have ADP in your body as well. So if your cells all of a sudden get some energy available, but they don't need it right this second, they can store that energy by taking the ADP in their cells and adding another phosphate group. So you change ADP to ATP. And that's going to store energy. So the ATP is the form of it that is holding on to energy. So you can see that it says a high energy bond up here. So that bond has a lot of energy in it. And so it's going to be stored there. So then when your cells then need energy a little bit later, they're going to break that bond between those 2 phosphate groups. They're going to release that. And when you break that bond, you release that energy. And now your cell can use that energy for whatever it needs it for, and this molecule is now turned back to ADP. So they can just go back and forth within your cell in a little cycle, kind of like this. Okay, so maybe you start with ADP in your cell. You're going to add energy. Usually, obviously, we get energy from food. So you're going to add some energy from your food, which is going to add a phosphate group onto it. It turns into ATP. And then when you need energy, you're going to break off that phosphate group and it turns back to ADP. And this cycle just repeats over and over again. So it's not like your body is having to make new ATP all the time. It's just going back and forth between ATP and ADP. So ADP, absorb energy, ATP, release. ADP, absorb energy, ATP, release. Okay, back and forth the whole time. Your cells use ATP for lots of things. Okay, we already talked about we need energy for a lot of different things. Active transport that we learned about last chapter needs energy. ATP is going to cause that source. If you have cilia or flagella that we learned about last chapter that help move a cell around, you need proteins to move those cilia and flagella to move the cell. They need energy, okay, to create proteins. And again, without proteins, you would be very dead. So to make those proteins that keep you alive, you need energy, okay? ATP is used for all of those, okay? ATP would be what this little lightning bug here is using to produce that light. In your cells, though, you only have a little bit of ATP. Okay? The ATP that's in your cells is really only going to last you a few seconds. So if you're trying to go out and play a basketball game, for example, that ATP that you right now have stored up in your body, not going to be enough. Okay? There's a good reason for that. So ATP is really, really effective at transferring energy, right? It can hold on to it and then let go, and your cell can use that. But if you want long-term storage, right, you're going to go play a basketball game, so you need energy now and you need energy in a couple hours, or you're running a marathon and you need energy in however long it takes you to do that, okay? It's not good at that long-term storage of large amounts of energy. So it's more efficient for your body to only hang on to a little bit of ATP, and then we use the energy from our food that we eat to undergo that ATP-ADP cycle that we found. So it's easier just to keep most of those molecules as ADP in your body, and then as your body needs them, they're going to use energy from your food to quick change ADP to ATP and release energy from those. Okay, so you don't have just huge amounts of ATP stored up in your body ready to go. So that's kind of where we're going to stop on the energy part for today. Now we're going to focus on chloroplasts, because hopefully you remember that photosynthesis occurs in chloroplasts. That's why it happens in plants and not in animals, because animal cells don't have chloroplasts. Okay, so there's going to be a couple important things when we talk about chloroplasts and photosynthesis. The first one is pigments, and this is going to be part of what your lab on Monday is going to be on. Okay, so if we talk about light, you look outside of the sun, the light you see from the sun is called white light. Okay, it doesn't have a color to it. But that white light is actually a mixture of a bunch of different wavelengths of light, okay? And in light, different wavelengths mean different colors. So what your eyes can see, we call the visible spectrum. That white light actually has all of the different colors of the rainbow. So you can see this picture up here. We have Roy G. Biv, if you remember the colors of the rainbow, right? Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Okay, this white light, that if you see all of these colors at once coming from the sun, it looks white, but you can break it apart. I mean, rainbows, that's what's happening, is you're breaking apart into their different wavelengths, that light. So pigments then are compounds that absorb light. So in green plants, the main pigment, so the principal pigment you have in plants is going to be chlorophyll. So that's what gives plants their green color. And we have chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. They're both generally going to be make plants appear different shades of green. Okay, those pigments absorb light in this red, kind of orange part of the spectrum, and then over here in the blue and violet part of the spectrum. So you notice they make green plants look green, they don't absorb green light. So that's actually how pigments work. So whatever, they actually reflect green light. So whatever color pigments reflect, that's what you see. Okay, so like I said, that chlorophyll is going to reflect green light, and that's why leaves appear green. Okay, so if you are wearing a red t-shirt, those pigments in your t-shirt are absorbing all of these wavelengths of light on the right side of this spectrum, and they reflect red. So whatever color is being reflected by the pigments, that's what color an object appears. Leaves are also going to have some other pigments in there. One is carotene. Carotene reflects that red-orange part. Carotene is really popular. It was really present in high amounts in carrots. That's why carrots are orange. Okay, so then they're going to be able to absorb that blue-green light. And the reason why a leaf wants both of these is because obviously if all you had is chlorophyll, you're reflecting all that green light. Well, now if you also have carotene, you're able to absorb some of that green light, so you're able to just use more of the light coming from the sun or whatever your light source is to be able to absorb more energy. So we're going to look a little bit closer at these chloroplasts then that are filled with all those pigments like chlorophyll and carotene. Okay. Chloroplasts, again, hopefully you know from last semester or last chapter, chloroplasts are where photosynthesis takes place. And the leaves in plants contain the most chloroplasts. They're where most of our photosynthesis takes place. Okay. That's going to be because, just think of surface area. There's the biggest surface area, so they're going to absorb the most sunlight. But any part of a plant that is green has chloroplasts in it. Okay. So chloroplasts are surrounded by two membranes. So you have this inner membrane that you can see, and you have an outer membrane that you can see. Okay, so we have two sets of membranes, and that's going to be important. That's where different processes in photosynthesis take place. And then they're going to be filled with these little sac-like objects called thylakoids. So these thylakoids, each little disc on this stack is a thylakoid. Okay, and those thylakoids are filled with chlorophyll, are filled with those pigments. And then those stacks of thylakoids, right, we stack them up and they're connected, and that whole stack is a granum, so plural, these are grana. So the grana is a stack of thylakoids. The fluid portion, so all these grana are surrounded by a fluid that we call the stroma. Okay. And so all these pigments that are in these chloroplasts, in these thylakoids, absorb light really efficiently, and then they transfer that energy to electrons in the chloroplast, okay? And then those electrons now have a lot of energy, and they're available then to do work, and that's going to lead us into photosynthesis. Plants are also going to use molecules. This is a molecule that's going to come up pretty soon here in this chapter. Things like NADP+, and those are basically just carrier molecules that transport those electrons wherever they need to go. And they're going to be key in that whole process of photosynthesis where we're trying to create sugar or trying to create food. So this is where we're going to leave off for now. This is kind of the background information that we're going to need to take with us when we then go talk about photosynthesis here in the future.